Como una cortesía hacia nuestro invitado, voy a cambiar al idioma inglés. So, welcome everyone to our seminar on generative artificial intelligence for education. As we all know, artificial intelligence, and especially generative artificial intelligence, has become a disruptive technology influencing nearly every aspect of our daily lives for several years now. Generative artificial intelligence for education is an area of special interest for our university to the extent that it has been included in our institutional development plan. That is why, among many other initiatives, we have established this seminar not only to stay informed about the latest developments, but also to inspire research, innovation, and new ways to enhance education with generative artificial intelligence. Today, we are honored to welcome a very special keynote speaker, Professor Dragan Gašević. Dragan Gašević is a distinguished professor of learning analytics in the Faculty of Information Technology and the director of the Center for Learning Analytics at Monash University, Australia. His research interests center around data analytics, artificial intelligence, and design methods that can advance the understanding of self-regulated and collaborative learning. Previously, he has been professor and the Sir Tim O'Shea Chair in Learning Analytics and Informatics in the Murray House School of Education and the School of Informatics, and co-director of Center for Research in Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh. He was the Canada Research Chair in Semantics and Learning Technologies and professor in the School of Computing and Information Systems at Athabasca University. He's a founder and served as the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, SOLAR, the world's leading research and professional organization in learning analytics. He has held several honorary professorships and industry fellowships in Asia, Australia, Europe, and North America. He served as a founding program chair of the International Conference on Learning, Analytics, and Knowledge, LAC, in 2011 and 2012, the general chair in 2016, a founding program co-chair of the Learning Analytics Summer Institute, LASI, in 2013 and 2014, and a founding editor of the Journal of Learning Analytics and Computers Education, Artificial Intelligence. In 2019-2023, he was recognized as the national field leader in educational technology in the Australian, which is the only Australian daily newspaper distributed nationwide. He led the European Union-funded Sheila project that received the Best Research Project of the Year award in 2019 from the Association for Learning Technology. In 2022, he received the Lifetime Member Award, the highest distinction of the Society for Learning Analytic Research, SOLAR, and named and distinguished member of the Association for Computing Machinery, ACM, the world's largest computing society. From a personal perspective, Professor Dragan Gašević is one of the most renowned leaders, if not the most influential of all, in the field of learning analytics and artificial intelligence for education worldwide. Professor Gašević, it's a great honor for our university, the National University of Mexico, and for all of us, faculty and research staff alike, to welcome you to this cyberspace. We deeply appreciate your time and enthusiasm in delivering today's keynote address, entitled Rethinking Learning, the Transformative Potential of Generative Artificial Intelligence in Education. As you can see, you have many fans in Mexico. There are over 350 attendees connected to this conference. Please, Professor Gašević, the cyberspace is yours. You can start whenever you are ready.
Thanks so much, Boris, for the kind invitation and also for the kind introduction of myself and my talk. I'm really honored to be speaking to you all today. I'm quite also humbled as well to see so many people joining us today. I saw some people had to leave because I can't speak Spanish. Apologies for that. Maybe in a near future I may learn some Spanish as well and give talks, but for the time being, please put up with my English. So today I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the things of what's going on with generative AI and the ways how we need to rethink what are the issues that are related to human learning as a consequence of the widespread adoption and the influence of generative AI. I think at this point, more or less everybody knows what we mean in principle with generative AI. When we say generative AI, we really mean mostly about the opportunities for us to generate some data in response to prompts. And generation of that data can be text, images, programming code, you name it, whatever types of data that could be there. So in principle, relatively simple concept and relatively simple idea. However, it had fairly tectonic changes and the influences on the education. It's almost this hidden invisible elephant that barged into our classrooms, that disrupted lots of things that are related to the ways how we assess our learners, and also disrupted lots of ways how our learners can learn, what they can learn, what should be learning, what should be teaching, and so on. The difficulty, though, is that for many, still, there is this kind of belief that AI is yet another hype, it's going to go away. And it's been already for more than 2.5 years since the current hype started, and it's not going to go away. Many of these technologies are here to stay, like our ChatGPTs, Geminis, or DeepSeeks. So rather than sticking our heads in the sand, we really need to think about how we can reinvent things we are doing. We did the analysis of the existing efforts that many institutions are doing around the world, and many of them provided lots of different guidance or policies or other types of suggestions to their faculty members and the students how to tackle the use of generative AI. But the problem is that many of these policies are based on the very early evidence and lots of assumptions and different types of understanding of what generative AI is, without really accounting for what is actually possible, what is not possible, what are the negative sides and so on of generative AI. Therefore, it's really, in my view, difficult to develop an effective policy in education systems without robust evidence and understanding of the implications. So to cover some of these things, late last year, our piece was published that more or less summarizes many of the points that I also am going to speak to you today about, and the ways how human learning is being shaped in the age of generative AI. What are those promises and challenges that we need to think about that? And that's specifically the big question that I want to will take you on as a part of the journey of my talk today as well, is to think about the promises, concerns, and the needs for human learning in the age of generative AI. I generally like to also give my conclusions at the start of my talks so that you actually get immediately what you came for. So in terms of the takeaway one, that's basically something that is a promise. And we will see today as well, there is really lots of promise for the use of generative AI to support learning, to provide us with some potentially useful resources, and also to help us improve some of our practices related to assessment and feedback. However, the issue with generative AI is also that it's not particularly reliable, and also that we do not know what are those future-ready skills for people that need to have in the age of generative AI. It goes way beyond generative AI literacy. At the same time, also, we need to reinvent our assessments because generative AI mostly hacked our existing assessment practices. And the final takeaway is this need for the robust research and evidence-informed decision-making. Some recent studies published in some of the best journals in the world came making some really very questionable claims and misinterpreting the existing evidence that we need to carefully interrogate. All right, so you got your conclusions. So now you can sit back and hear me what I'm going to say in more depth about some of these things. With respect to some of the promises, early last year, we did a survey of the existing literature in terms of the use of large language models as the main generative AI technology. And we identified a number of different things that generative AI can be used for, from the perspective of profiling and labeling learners and their learning strategies or the conversations, to the detection of different types of behaviors, to the assessment, different types of predictive modeling, feedback, and so on. We're going to zoom in into the 4 specific areas here. I want to talk, number 1, about the promise of generative AI for learning support. Many of you heard of probably Khan Academy and their technology, which is called Kamigo. Kamigo is just one of the many technologies that many people around the world are now developing. I'm just mentioning Kamigo because it just received so much prominence. And the idea behind Kamigo is that you can now develop a tutor that is following lots of different Socratic types of moves that allows you to tutor students to learn different types of subjects. It can also be designed in such a way and used in such a way to support creativity as well. There are also more recent studies that are emerging that are talking about the effectiveness of these type of technologies. So, for example, there was a study that was reported by the World Bank about the use of these chatbots in Nigeria in schools, where they are indicating considerable improvements in learning gains for the kids who were using these type of Gen AI-powered chatbots. There are also other chatbots like Tutor Copilot that was developed at Stanford University, where they're primarily intended for these type of chatbots to support teachers who can become better teachers in supporting their students. So the idea of this, and this is really nice piece that tells us that these type of technologies are not aiming to replace teachers, which I think it's a really not particularly good idea at this stage, but rather to enhance teachers' abilities so that the impact of the teachers can be more effective. And this very specific study as well that I'm citing here is reporting on a randomized controlled trial that demonstrated that the impact of the teachers with use of these type of technologies on their students was significantly improved as a consequence. So that's a really promising thing. There are also some more specific domain tools that are developed. So this is a piece of technology developed as a collaboration between Microsoft, German university, and a US university, where they were basically supporting computer programming and allowing the students to receive different types of hints as a consequence of their exercise to debug and understand and comprehend the code as part of the process. So that was published in the Top Learning Analytics Conference last year. While we are seeing lots of these promising things that are out there available, the challenge, though, is that many of these technologies are mostly having this conversational layer, something that improves our communication with a certain system. However, most of these existing chatbots that are supposed to support human learning do not have something which is the heart of many intelligent tutoring systems, a well-established technology in AI and education for many years, and that's called learner models. So in other words, they're really good at providing dialogic tutoring support and also provide certain strategies that are kind of being optimal the way how we can engage our learners, but how we are measuring what learners are doing and so on, that's in many cases still not sufficiently supported. I'm going to touch very briefly on that in a few moments again. So number 2 is that generative AI can be really useful for producing learning resources. colleague here in Australia, Anisha Bakaria, talked a fair bit about some of these things. And there are also lots of different emerging as well technologies, like in Australia, Cognitive by Daniel Liu, as well as the University of Sydney, that are offering some of these type of technologies. So in other words, with relatively simple prompting, you can generate ideas for the content, ideas for the learning design, potentially even produce the content in a web-ready format that can be deployed to certain types of places. For us, we mostly collaborated with our colleagues in Brazil as well to generate practice questions and also short answers for the students so that we can build question and answering systems for the students. We played with that not in English, but in Brazilian Portuguese. That tells you that also there's even good likelihood that it can be quite effective in Spanish as well. And what we found is in particular that these type of technologies are really good when we have no native speakers that are getting these type of question and answering. So in other words, if your students are trying to learn something in English as well, they can actually benefit from some of these technologies, except that there are certain boundary conditions as well that, for example, the lowest level of remembering and creating levels of Bloom's taxonomy, that was not really so effective. We also see in the literature as well that many people are trying to use and generate multimodal content and trying to teach students how to effectively prompt their technologies to promote creativity, motivation, and performance. But it's also particularly useful in this specific cases because it addresses special needs of many different learners who may have certain sensory impairments. The area where most of my heart and interest lies is in the area of automated feedback, because feedback is a chronic disease, if you wish, that many higher education institutions are experiencing simply because we're expected always to educate as many students as possible and always more every year, while at the same time we have the same amount of resources or even fewer because of many different factors that go beyond what we can affect. So what we, in this case, have and what we see is that generative AI actually can generate fairly good, timely, targeted, potentially actionable feedback in different modalities. We had a study on this topic that was published late last year as well, where we looked into the quality of the feedback that generative AI can produce versus what human tutors are doing. And we found is that most of generative AI is producing much more readable feedback than the human instructors, which is probably also somewhat expected because human instructors have very limited time for each student to provide them with some snippet of feedback, while generative AI doesn't care, can generate as much text as needed. However, what we found is also there was relatively limited alignment of what generative AI identifies as positives and negatives versus human tutors. In many cases, we actually found that there's a place of good opportunities because we can create a recommender system for human tutors to pick and choose some of these snippets of feedback from the generative AI, and then that human tutors or human instructors can be much more efficient in doing some of these things. And what we also found really interesting is that generative AI is not necessarily providing just feedback on the task level, whether something is correct or not, or the other way, how that can be done. But it actually is offering the students some prompts, what to think in the future, how to approach learning. That gets us to the levels, if some of you are familiar with the models of feedback proposed by Hattie and Timberley, is that we are actually providing feedback on the process and the self-regulation level. We also built this system, I'm going to be mentioning several times in my talk today, is the system that allows us to support students' self-regulated learning as part of the process. We also support lots of different writing analytics, how students are doing. So we can use generative AI to mark up the quality of students' writing in terms of the way how they are integrating evidence as different sources of information they are trying to use. What we are also seeing is that generative AI is also potentially really useful to do something, to use multimodal data about human learning into something which we call data comics. And that's a collaboration led in our team by the talented Mexican researcher Roberto Martinez Mandelado. And so in that process, most of that work and learning is happening in the physical spaces. So this is the nursing simulation room at Monash University, where nurses all have certain sensors. They wear certain wristbands so that we can get their heart rate or electrodermal activity. They also wear the mics. We also have a camera, 180 degrees camera that is recording what is happening in the room. We also are having the location sensors. In these simulations, nurses are expected to collaborate. But then they also have an actor whose job is just to make them miserable, to disrupt them from their primary task. Underneath of these things, we do lots of learning analytics and machine learning, where we analyze all these data from different sensors. And we prepared certain analytics for them on the form of a dashboard that can be used later by their teaching team when they go into the debrief. They finish that, like imagine a team plays a game. After the game, the coach gets them and then tells them different types of statistics, gives them how certain teams played, and then basically discuss some of these things with them. So this is basically how one of the teaching team members is discussing with them different bits of evidence. But what we also observed that many of these visualizations may not be so clear to understand to our students. And we want them to do the reflections on these visualizations. So one thing that we found that works potentially really promisingly is that instead of presenting them with these very sophisticated charts, we can actually generate the comics like this one. So different types of scenarios with the use of text to image, large language models that are supporting multimodality, we can get these type of nice little stories that students, many are actually getting motivational boost because of that. Some of them say, oh, finally showed me as a hero and so on. So it's a really promising thing. But the other thing also what we developed, and it is really very promising, is this technology we call Wiz Chat, that students can see the dashboard and then they can ask the questions with the chatbot, all sorts of things. So then the chatbot is really capable to do that. So what we observe with this type of chatbot, especially the chatbot is designed in such a way to actually ask the learners to think carefully about these type of things. Not only do learners improve when they are using the chatbots in terms of their comprehension of what is shown in these dashboards and accuracy to correctly interpret the visualizations, but they actually continue even growing to improve their comprehension and accuracy even once they don't have access to the chatbot, which is really very promising thing that helps us to think about how we can keep improving also data literacy of our learners. The final promising direction is the assessment as well in the age of artificial intelligence. A couple of years ago, we did the analysis of different types of things that can be done in that space, and we identified that AI can make lots of our assessments much more feasible because it takes time to do good types of assessments. Assessment to become much more continuous, to become more adaptive, and to be done in more authentic settings. As I just talked about a very authentic setting as well for that type of assessment. I want to just touch on one of these opportunities here, and that's the assessment to be more continuous. And what we really mean with the continuous assessment in many cases is that we want to measure the processes of learning and learners are engaging with. And that's typically the dark side of our assessment, like the dark side or the far side of the moon. And that's the opportunity that we can actually leverage lots of machine learning and deep learning with different types of sequential and temporal modeling of the students' clicks and other types of pieces of evidence, so we can provide them with a meaningful formative assessment. So this is again the Flora environment in which we are collecting lots of clicks, mouse movements, and everything what students are doing. Behind the scenes, we also do lots of analytics to understand when they are engaging into the planning of their learning, when they are setting the goals, when they are potentially using ineffective learning strategies. And then based on that insight from the analytics, we generate prompts, and then we feed that into the large language models that provide these types of scaffolds for the learners that can be done at a fixed moments in time or when certain conditions are met as well for the learners. And you can see they are the language-like. And what you found is that many learners comply strictly with these type of scaffolds. And we also found that these type of scaffolds are leading into the better performance. At least what we so far studied is the reading and writing types of tasks, both in higher education and in secondary schools. Behind the scene, what we are doing to generate these type of things is that we, inside of the environment, have different types of tools. Students can highlight, search information, take note, plan, use ChatGPT. We collect all these data, and then we develop the algorithms that can map that into the processes of metacognition, cognition, problem solving, and so on. We validated these, and they allow us to generate these sophisticated scaffolds. Then you can say, okay, Dragan, that's all fine, but how is that related to assessment? Well, here's one thing that you may want to pay attention to, and that's that these processes that we are measuring and the time that students are spending on them, they are highly predictive of students' outcomes. So in other words, when we are trying to predict students' essay scores, and this is one of these predictive modeling, you can see these green bars on this chart. They explain more variance, like how much time students spend on organizing the information or rereading or planning and so on, then that just the properties of the essays that they produce, like, for example, coverage of certain topics, cohesion of the essays, and so on. And you will see why this is now important in the age of generative AI, because you really want to assess the students how they are effectively engaging with their writing, rather than to just look at the final product, because that final product can be outsourced in many cases very easily to the generative AI. All right, so this is the fine, promising part of my story today. However, there's lots of also concerns that we need to think about. First concern is that, I'm sure many of you also are aware of that, is that generative AI is not flawless. That's really a fact. A beautiful book published in 2019, still very much valid in spite of being published in 2019, predicted all these things because they are part of the fundamental architectural flows of most of the modern generative AIs. That reasoning and planning is really not the strong feature, despite that some very expensive versions of some of the generative AI are showing some promises recently. But a sense of truthfulness is really not the thing that generative AI can do. Spatial and temporal awareness is also not easy for them. Causal inference, common sense, and containment of lots of different types of biases. There was this piece that was stopped being updated in 2023, partially because they identify all sorts of flaws that are still present in many of these type of technologies, but you're most welcome to just explore this document. It'll be a really interesting reading piece. Why this is important, why I'm saying? Well, because many people are still unaware of these type of things. It seems, for whatever unclear reason to me, is that lawyers are particularly susceptible to it. Many lawyers so far have been caught and got in trouble by using ChatGPT to produce certain court filings, except that generative AI made many court cases that they are citing up. They were not actual court cases. One lawyer got penalized in the US. More recently, a couple of months ago or last month, here in Australia, another immigration lawyer was also basically having a disciplinary action against them because of such misconduct as well. So it seems that we really need to pay attention, first of all, to AI literacy. But my point is also, and this is really what we want to think about more broadly, is that we need to be developing human skills while benefiting from the power of AI. And you will see in a moment why I think this is really important. Because we really need to reimagine the skills and knowledge people need to develop. So about a year ago, or less than a year ago, I came up with this model that we still are conceptualizing in terms of a paper, but it kind of gives you that we have two key dimensions. One dimension of our skills is the work, how we are applying some of our skills. And for that, we can use lots of different types of AI assistants or AI support tools. Those are our ChatGPTs. And we can see that's on our horizontal dimension. And we can get kind of an impression that we have these high, what I call AI-empowered skills. They can improve our performance, like on essays and so on. But as long as they are a good fit for the task and we know how to effectively use that tool. But then there is this other dimension. That's the human learning, how we develop our skills. So the idea of ChatGPT is not to develop our skills. It's just to force how to quickly develop our task. But if it's tuned well, it can also be used as a tutor. The ultimate goal, what we want to have, is that we have this combination of high human and AI-empowered skills. And my hypothesis for that is that you can only get to that upper right corner if you have high human skills. Otherwise, it's impossible to get to that space. But then, really, the high performance with AI support does not imply high human skills. It may actually be quite contradictory, that may lead us to the illusion of somebody's competence, because high human skills are not equal to AI-empowered skills. I'm just going to quickly show you one example of a study. So we published this study early last year with colleagues from the University of Queensland, where they developed this nice system that allows for peer feedback among the students when they are crowdsourcing different types of questions. So what they developed this system for is because many students could not write really good questions, so they introduced peer feedback and peer assessment to help them improve the quality of that. But then they realized also that students are not also good at providing feedback. So then to address that limitation of the providing feedback, they developed some of these tools where they kind of created certain algorithms based on generative AI that can help the students improve that feedback. But that tool itself was not really aiming to improve students' feedback. It was more aiming to improve their efficiency or productivity at generating that feedback. So then with them, we reported on this randomized controlled trial in which we had about 1,600 students who used this AI support tool for 4 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, these students were divided into 4 separate groups randomly. And one group continued using this tool for 4 weeks. One group had no support tool at all. One group got we call that self-monitoring checklist, but it was a good old rubric. And one group got the combination of the AI support and the self-monitoring checklist. What happened is basically that students' overall quality of feedback was really high when they initially had the AI support. However, the benefits were completely wiped when AI support was removed. In other words, nothing got stuck with students in terms of their improvement of the skills. The other thing is that we found that there was really no evidence of this combination of high human and AI empowered skills. In other words, what we found is that students were either in this high AI empowered skills or high human skills area. And this is very consistent with a recent meta-analysis published in Nature, Human Behavior as well, that says there are very limited situations in which we are seeing this synergetic effect between human and AI empowerment or combinations. In other words, there is either augmentation of certain skills or in many cases just a replacement of the human skills. So then there's really one big risk for us that we need to tackle in education. And that's the risk of the dependence on generative AI. And more importantly, on something I'm going to be quickly talking about in a few moments as well, is the low metacognitive activity of the students. When the students have low metacognitive activity, which means the students are really not thinking about what they are doing. They're not carefully self-assessing the quality of their products. And this really leads us to the other implication of this, and that's the disruption of our assessment practice. And we really need to have a direction to develop these high human and AI empowered skills. So big question we all need to be always asking ourselves is, when we can complete some of the assessment tasks by offloading them entirely onto the technology such as ChatGPT, do we have an illusion of human skills if the products are the only thing that we are assessing? Because students just deliver us a product. Yes, that's a very scalable way to do it, but it's also the way that can be now easily hacked. So I want you to think about this new paradigm for assessment that we've been working on. And that paradigm really is focusing on the thinking of the human learning. And in most of the cases, when we are traditionally focusing on assessment, we are focusing on the assessments of the products. But then in the age of AI, AI is providing us the methods and techniques I already talked about that can be used to improve our assessment practices, but also changing this context, because now many of these products can easily be outsourced to the AI. Except that our assessments needs to be informed by this new changed context, and the AI is also part of the use of that process. What is the direction that we are working on in terms of the changing assessment paradigm is that instead of just assessing the products, we need to assess students' processes as well as their metacognition, because we really want to have them to think about and judge about what they are working on. And the ultimate goal for us is that we want to have these formative assessments. I'm going to now give you a more specific example how we are specifically going through. I'm going to be using an example that comes from clinical reasoning in the collaboration with a medical school we have in this context. So we are building on something which is called evidence-centered design, well-established paradigm for assessment. And that basically has three key components: the definition of the task, the definition of the student model, that's the set of skills that we need to think about, and then what type of evidence we need to have. So we first say that our tasks need to be very authentic. So I already mentioned some of these examples before. The other important thing is that our tasks need to include certain types of activities for the students so that they can demonstrate how they are learning, in other words, certain learning processes. They need to incorporate the use of AI as part of their improved performance for the type of tasks. And at the same time, we need to measure metacognition. So I'm going to show you now a very specific example how we are doing that. So in our Flora environment, I already said we can measure lots of self-regulatory processes, including metacognitive processes that students are engaging, like metacognitive monitoring and control. This is the authentic task that we are working on with medical students. They're engaging the virtual standard patient, trying to diagnose them. In our case, we primarily are working with the pulmonary, so far, physicians, but we are open to many other areas as well. The idea for them is to then, for students to produce a product where they are identifying a set of possible diagnoses, preliminary diagnosis, and eventually come up with a differential diagnosis for their patients. But then as part of the process, we also allow them to access another chatbot who has a role of a more experienced physician. And that more experienced physician is like as if they are kind of sitting in the room in the back, and they can occasionally get the certain nudges as a scaffolding process. Also, we allow students to use ChatGPT directly to get certain advices as well as they are getting as part of the process. And as I said, finally, we are collecting all the trace data, how students are interacting with certain content, what sources else they are using, how they are going back and forth between all these different agents that we have for them in the environment. Eventually, once the task is finished, we have an automatic approach that takes all these sources of information, assesses students' interaction with the patient, with all these other sources that they were interacting with the use of generative AI, and provides them with a feedback based on the rubric, and then eventually gives them the scores as well. So that's basically where we are now in this process. I want to also briefly touch on the ethical implications of generative AI in education. So here's the thing. Large language models do not have necessarily high level of transparency. We don't know what is happening in terms of the inner working behind large language models. Also, the other important thing is that at least as of mid last year, majority of the systems that were developed based on AI were only transparent to AI researchers and practitioners, not so much to students, learners, or parents. So in other words, we are dealing with these black boxes. There's the other important thing is the privacy issues that we really do not know how and the extent to which certain data are collected. The other important thing is also that many of the users of the large language models are not transparently indicating that students are dealing with an AI system. So the idea is that many of the important decisions about student assessment should be actually deferred to the humans. And then whenever something is generated with AI, one of the recommendations is to have that label that is generated by AI. Something to think about and the extent to which that is feasible as well, because we are finding also emerging evidence that tells us the moment you tell the people that something was provided by AI, people dislike it. And that's connected to something in the literature that is called algorithmic aversion. In other words, people, when you generate feedback to students either automatically or by human, they don't basically express any differences. However, when you tell them this was generated by AI, they immediately hate it and they feel almost cheated. The other important thing is bias in these large language models. Just try on ChatGPT or Gemini some of these prompts. Image of a patriotic dog superhero. You will see this very much US ideal of the chatbot. So by default, the model itself is biased towards the US type of culture. For you Mexicans, you just need to add also Mexican, or for me, who have, I don't know, multiple nationalities, I would need always to say that. So at least you can mitigate some of these things, but I'm not still sure whether certain features that are shown in some of these images are still quite representative of Mexico, although obviously the Mexican flag and Mexican colors are quite prominent. That's one challenge. But then there's another challenge that many of these technologies have even more fundamental biases. Indian Prime Minister actually spoke quite widely about that last month as well at the AI summit in Paris. But just try, any of you, try to ask Gemini or ChatGPT to generate an image of left-handed person writing. It's always going to generate a right-handed person, simply because the data are so predominant from the right-handed persons in their data sets, and it's really difficult. The other thing is I can see most of these images, you're typically just getting a man that is writing some of these things. So that tells you about some of these biases that is really so easy to surface with the use of some of these technologies. All right, so I'm gonna coming to the final part of my talk, and hopefully there are 5 more minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for questions. So what are the future needs? You can see that there's lots of opportunities and challenges, but we really need to have good evidence-informed decision making. So in other words, we need solid evidence to scrutinize the value of some of these technologies. We did our lit review that specifically focused on the empirical studies that looked into some of these things. And in many cases, we can see that promises that even I mentioned do not mean always actual improvements in human learning because of the caveats as well that I mentioned. I want to talk here briefly about some of these big challenges. One important thing is that nicely presented content that generative AI can produce is not necessarily great for human learning, because humans really have a tendency when something is easy for us to process, looks very nice to process, we have an illusion of truth effect that is well documented in the literature. In other words, when ChatGPT spits out the lie, if it's packaged nicely, people are just going to have a tendency to accept it, no questions asked. The other thing is also what we found is that when generative AI is offering certain answers or support to the students, students have a much more limited engagement with their metacognition. In other words, they do not really evaluate what generative AI is telling them. They just take it at the face value and accept it. And we call that metacognitive laziness in our recent papers. Similar was also identified by others without calling it metacognitive laziness, but fits under that umbrella and talks about the issues of the use of ChatGPT versus human responses on certain different types of question answering fora. And what we basically found is that although ChatGPT has lots of inaccuracies and can be even quite verbose, human learners prefer ChatGPT responses because they look nice. That's basically the challenge that is there. The other important thing is that there are more accounts that if students are just using ChatGPT versus when they are not using anything, the use of ChatGPT leads them to the decline of their own abilities. This was shown in a study that looked at the mathematics and the use of ChatGPT on the mathematics education and demonstrating that negative effect. The final big question, and I don't have an answer, and this is basically coming from the educational and cognitive psychology, is that we know that writing is a big, important learning tool. What happens when much of that tool is offloaded to generative AI? How we are developing some of our critical thinking, metacognitive or cognitive abilities that writing as a powerful learning tool is affording us to have. And then the other important thing is also how we can expect that many learners can prompt some of these generative AI technologies effectively, but they don't know how to ask effective questions. That's a really another big thing that's well documented in the literature, that people don't necessarily know how to write good questions or ask in-person conversations. One final point I want to discuss is the methodological rigor. For us, to be able to produce sound evidence, we need to have strong methodological rigor. I've been talking about this, and I'm actually becoming boring to myself for the last 3 years since the hype started. Yet it seems for many people that's still not clear enough. So there was a recent meta-analysis published in the top education journal, Computers and Education, which made some of these claims like ChatGPT enhances academic performance, boosts affective motivational states, reduces mental effort, everything is great. And that made me pretty unsettled with this paper as well. And that basically sparked lots of social media attention. So you can see some of these dialogues and the recent comment. Soon our commentary is going to be published, hopefully in Computers and Education or some other place, if not. But the problem is that that study made some really unsound assumption about what is learning. So I want to basically tell you a couple of key sins of past signs about generative AI. They equate high student performance to learning. So for example, you ask students to do the translation of certain text with ChatGPT versus to do it by themselves. Of course, they are going to perform better if they are using ChatGPT. But Who learned better? The learners who were doing that by themselves or when they were using ChatGPT? Or the other sin that's been there for almost 40 years in educational technologies is that whenever there's a new technology, people equate that to effective pedagogy, which is not the case. We always need to develop a new pedagogy that amplifies the effects of certain technologies. The other challenge that is also quite evident was basically also published at MIT, where a couple of years ago, when they kind of said that GPT-4 can ace MIT tests, that basically was quite irritating to the students at MIT, who then basically looked what these professors claimed to be the case, and they identified there was lots of data contamination, the use of generative AI to do the reliability testing, and lots of basically unclarities in the manual verification of these things. So all what I'm trying to say is that we need to establish very robust standards for appraising the quality of evidence of generative AI's effect on human learning, performance, different pedagogical practices, and so on. And that can only really be done if we have longitudinal studies, because otherwise we don't know how some of these things are affecting human skills. All right, I spoke a fair bit, just a couple of final remarks. So I hope I made an argument for you that we need to really broaden our understanding of learning with, about, and really this final part, despite generative AI. And as AI is unlikely to go away, we need to lead the change, us educators, together with our students, because nobody else will come to rescue us on this journey. Some of these things that I mentioned here, they are available in these couple of papers. And on that very happy note, thanks so much for your attention and look forward to taking some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dragan, for such an interesting talk on a topic that is of great relevance for education. As you can see, we received many questions, some in Spanish, some in English. So if you agree, I can read them to you so that
yes,
you
please.
don't have to be worried about the translation. So let's start. Take the most of the time we have. The first one comes from Edith Gutierrez. She says, what AI tools can be used for qualitative investigation, for qualitative research?
It's a good question. Look, I mean, I think technologies like ChatGPT themselves can be used for these type of things. They can be useful for the thematic analysis. We published a paper on that. It's available. We also use it effectively for coding when you have more deductive approaches, when you have an established coding scheme, and there are different approaches. It's called zero-shot, few-shot, or one-shot learning, where you basically zero-shot is you just give a description of your rubric. Sometimes works, in many cases it does not. Sometimes work when you give one or two examples, and sometimes you have to give lots of examples to work how you coded some of these things. But yeah, that's basically is coming there. It does not necessarily work in every case. You need to really kind of understand the context of the situation and the types of data that you have.
Thanks a bunch. Next one. If the goal is improve my skills and use Gen AI, can you give us a kind of guide or advices? What tools I have to use or learn?
That's a really good question. I think in many cases, I would say just start with some of the general purpose tools like ChatGPT or Gemini or DeepSeek. They are there. They are freely available, at least to a certain extent. There are many tutorials on the web and around the world as well that allows you to think carefully about how certain prompting strategies can be developed. So in my slides, I have a link to a colleague's slide deck that is specifically created for educators with lots of different prompting strategies, how that can be used for many daily education types of tasks. I would say have a look at that, Anisha Bakaria. I'm happy to share my slides as well with Victor and the colleagues, and I'm happy to be shared with the participants as well, so you can actually access that information and see. In my view, that will be a good start. There are also more recently more specialized tools many of them are not necessarily open source. For example, here in Australia, Cognitive is gaining lots of momentum at the University of Sydney. Others are also developing similar types of tools.
Thank you very much. I will be on the look of your slides because many people is asking for them. Okay, next one. How AI can help me in the classroom? And she gave us some context. I ask an essay about a topic to my students. They use AI to create essay. How can I encourage students to use wisely AI to help them to improve their essay and not only copy and paste it?
It's a really good question. I think in many cases, look, one of the key things is that you can ask them to come up with some of these essays with AI. And in the class, they need to come and criticize these essays, how they did it, right? You can also, in the classroom as well, think about how they are writing these things with the generative AI and discuss. We also developed this system I was talking about, Flora, which actually collects all their students' interaction with generative AI directly. And then we basically can then provide analytics and feedback on them, how they are using some of these things. So I think in the future, you will be actually getting more and more of these type of tools that are providing the analytics for the teachers so that you are actually not only assessing the student's product of the essay, but you're also assessing the student's process, how they worked on it. So if you identify that they all just slapped whatever the generative AI spit out, you will not be actually given them highly on that process. So that would be one thing. And the other important thing is also to request some of these annotations, because that's been done in the portfolio-based assessment. You can actually ask students in the class, while they generate their essays with generative AI, then ask them to annotate them within the class so that they don't have access to the generative AI.
Thank you so much. Next one, during the talk, ChatGPT and Gemini were mentioned. Is there any other studies about some other AIs like Grok, or will they be available with the time?
Grok is relatively new. Grok just showed up very recently, so there are not as many studies on Grok. There are more studies on Llama. Llama is an open source. I think that's for us in education particularly important. I think DeepSeek is really powerful technology. It's built on top of Llama as well. I know several colleagues in Latin America who've been using DeepSeek for quite a long time now, which is really interesting. So I think there will be more of these studies emerging outside of these, how to put them, for service commercial types of generative AI.
Thanks. Well, we have many questions. You, Dragan, tell me when to stop. I will.
Yeah, I can keep going. No worries.
Okay. You tell us, right? Okay, next one. Will generative AI at some point become an area of study and subsequently generate specializations in more specific areas?
Look, I think it's a really good question. I think we are seeing more and more of that we need to either fine-tune or develop domain-specific language models for particular areas. That's partially in connection to the point I was making before, that generative AI hallucinates. Generative AI is not reliable, doesn't know the facts, and the more specialized content and the context you have for the generative AI, the amount of some of these errors is being minimized. Doesn't mean it's going to be eliminated entirely, but it's going to be minimized.
Right. Next one from Fernando Vergara. I am trying to build a map app to measure student skills. Do you believe LLMs can help with this?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I mean, obviously, what kind of skills? What do you want to develop and so on, right? So I was talking about, like, for example, you can develop an app that helps students improve their prompting skills as well. So the way how they are prompt, every prompt that they send, you can analyze it and think about it. You can also develop an app that develops and analyzes automatically what type of questions, how students are asking questions. You can provide them with feedback on that. Some of these algorithms that I think it's completely unexplored, and why DeepSeek got so much attention is because it's using this algorithm which is called the chain of Thoth. which provides, like, whenever you go to DeepSeek, it gives you the whole reasoning, why, how they're going to answer, etc. I think it's a tremendous resource that we can use to actually guide our students as well, how to think about some of these things and develop the new types of skills.
Thanks a bunch. Next one, Sergio Chavez. Well, first of all, he says, truly great material. Thanks a lot. And his question is, what about the road ahead? What are the main implications of generative AI work concerning critical thinking needed for research and professional work?
It's a great question, Sergio. Look, I mean, I mentioned the metacognitive laziness, and that's my red flag as we are going forward, and the extent to which our learners may actually become metacognitively lazy. So that's why I think ultimately, if the learners just offload everything into some of these technologies, their critical thinking will completely be diminishing. So the question is that we need to come up with a more challenging type of tasks as well. As the opportunities for them to perform on the relatively standard types of tasks is increasing, we also need to increase our standards. We need to increase our expectations so that learners can actually hit the wall. Like, for example, I was talking today about some of these biases that are present in the large language models. So you want to identify the types of tasks in which generative AI can easily spit out some inaccuracies and incorrect information. And so that you actually can confront the students to see how then they can actually deal with these type of things, because that's the type of skill that it will need quite a lot.
Next one. Is it possible to learn something wrong in one model, intentionally created that way by a researcher programmer, and use another to indicate that everything learned was wrong and stick with the right thing?
Absolutely, that's what we are doing. I mean, we are using, I mean, I can tell you, like, I'm recently planning certain things to do, and when I'm engaging certain strategies, trying to plan, strategize, like what I'm going to do, etc., and negotiate with certain groups. So I typically use generative AI to help me. I give them the context of the situation. I give them the basic expectations that I have, why I engage into something like that. And then I also then start asking what kind of moves they may have on their side. And then once that LLM gives me, and then I send it to another LLM to actually review it and tell me what was wrong and to critically analyze it and so on. We also used in that way as well, for example, some of these scaffolds that generative AI was produced, like ChatGPT, and then we asked Gemini to review it. We found that Gemini is actually far less biased in the assessment of some of these things, while ChatGPT is better in terms of generating less hallucinations for some of these things. Gemini, we found that it's actually less biased when it's doing some of these assessments. So absolutely, just confront them, basically put them to fight to each other.
Right. Next one comes from Sophia Ixchel. What would you recommend to someone who works in a university and is forced by the university's authorities to implement AI learning assistants?
It's a good question. My view is that you can't resist these things. I mean, my question is, and that's what I was actually saying, is being forced is not ideal. You don't want to be forced in some of these things. So on the other hand, that's where your learners are. They are all using these type of AI tools, right? So some of these tools can be useful. Some of these tools can be quite annoying, right? So our university doesn't want to give us any of these assistants. So I'm using quite extensively some of these generative AI, but I'm very careful how I'm using them, right? And I'm very skeptical in many cases, whatever they spit out. So you kind of very carefully look at some of these things. But at the same time, in many cases, they can give you like a useful starting point. So I would basically just evaluate them on a case-by-case situation. If they are too much annoyance to you, don't use some of these internal assistants. But I will also be very careful if many of these learning assistants are there. Think about the model that I presented 2 by 2, where you have basically the performance versus the actual human learning. And also think about what is the evidence of that, whether these assistants are actually going to hurt our learners or they are developing some abilities. Even these abilities are completely new things that we did not even think of 3 or 4 years ago.
Next one comes from Irene. Since AI is now responsive and it learns very quickly, do you think it will eventually replace human teachers by avatar teachers?
It's a good question. Look, in many situations, when we have the face-to-face things, people will still be inclined to have the face-to-face interactions because they are building the communities and so on. There are situations in which we can generate quite good content online that is provided with generative AI and is doing certain things. But I want to go back to the point that I was previously making, and that's the algorithmic conversion. People don't like these type of things. The moment they realize it was artificially generated, people dislike that because of the lots of reasons. We have a recent paper as well that is hopefully be published. So I think the concept of being replaced or not, it's not that simple. It's not just a matter of the efficiency, it's the matter of the relationships that you have, it's the matter of the social emotional learning, and it's the matter of the community. So I don't anticipate that in any foreseeable future. However, I can see that in many situations, like videos like today's, that I also made little sentences where I kind of made grammar errors, etc., they can be improved. In other cases, you can actually use that to generate in many different languages. So that to put today's talk and put Spanish words in my mouth, right? So I'd be very happy with this type of thing. So these type of situations likely would happen.
Okay. If you agree, I will ask you 3 more questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Many. Okay, next one. In your opinion, does AI Gen make the person who uses it more dependent for solving problems?
Could you say again, please, repeat that question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah, in your opinion, does AI Generative make the person who uses it more dependent?
Look, I mean, it may help do certain things. The key thing is like generative AI necessarily. So here's the thing. There are different concepts that we are thinking about, that AI can complement you to do certain things. In other words, you are actually approaching the same task in the same way, but you can actually define a new type of task as well that you are doing with AI. That's more like the augmentation as part of the process. So look, the use of computers and email is now far more efficient than for you to use the handwriting and send it by the post, right? How many of you are sending regularly letters? They are nice and everything, but they are disappearing. In the same way, when I'm actually dealing with lots of administrative forms, etc., and they ask me lots of different responses, I just source lots of ideas from generative AI because I'm very happy to be dependent on some of these things. But AI is not really replacing your thinking. AI is not replacing the way of you generating ideas. You can bounce off certain ideas of generative AI if you are not sure how that may sound, etc. But always talk to other people because AI can actually create an echo chamber for you. So to a certain extent, yes, becomes one other tool in your toolkit, a very important tool. You cannot ignore it. You will be dependent for some things, just like you're dependent on email today. But you will still have to preserve and depend on lots of your cognitive faculties.
Next one. What tools exist for the learner to have control over the data they produce and the uses to which they put it?
Oh, really good question. Very few, almost none, right? So Google allows you to inspect what type of data they collect, and you can do and manipulate a little bit. In terms of some of these educational technologies that we are having, universities like whatever LMS, learners really don't have much access to that, sadly. So sorry to disappoint you.
Okay. Next one. How can we link really the use of AI with metacognition so that its use is formative and educative?
Yeah, good question. I mean, we didn't have much time today to talk about some of these things, but we are using generative AI to create prompts for the students. Like we analyze their interaction with the system, etc., and then we push information onto the students that is precisely aiming for students to engage into different types of metacognitive processes. What we are seeing, at least based on our existing studies, is that students are quite happy to accept that advice, especially if it's encouraged and supported by the teaching team. So we are seeing that they engage more in planning, they engage more into metacognitive monitoring and so on, because the system actually is not necessarily telling you have to do it, or we said, we notice you are not metacognitive monitoring. We are actually using the language that is clear to them, and we give them the prompts that are kind of, oh, have you thought of some of these things? And I said, many students say, yeah, oh, wow, that reminded me to think about these things, because otherwise I would have missed. So these type of tools are not necessarily as available everywhere, but I think generative AI is reducing the cost for many people to easily develop some of these technologies and use them. So I anticipate they will be more and more prevalent around the world.
Next one is quite interesting. Mauricio says, thanks for the great presentation. Today, the state government of Baja California announced the adoption of Google AI tools for primary education. Any suggestions about who and how to go about advising the government about doing these experiments besides the tech companies?
It's a great question. I think academics really have difficult time to just do some of these things. I think we need to be kind of better in the advocacy of some of these things. Ideally, if that's in Mexico, you really want to have few prominent academics who are really interested in that kind of public engagement and giving the lots of pieces in different opinion editorials in the local national media or certain other interviews, etc. I think we do not allow at this stage. We basically allow easily that discourse to be dominated by big tech, but at the same time, big tech just have so much more resources, and they easily get access to the different organizations, and many decision makers really do not have this deep understanding of the things. So for us, if we want to have some of that impact and the change, we need to actually have the ear of the decision makers. Otherwise, they will continue doing these decisions.
Yeah. So let's get involved. Okay.
Yeah.
Next one, Jose Luis says, would you say that actually for teachers, the proper way to implement Gen AI tools is as tutors guided always by human teachers? In other words, teach students to ask the proper questions or prompts and use critical thinking to assess the answers?
My view is that it has to be part of our really critical skill set that we are developing our learners. I think I have really at home an 8-year-old daughter. She is so suspicious of ChatGPT because we showed you numerous things that for her own schooling that we asked it, and ChatGPT spit out incorrect answers, silly answers, etc. So she's really not trusting ChatGPT at all. And I think the teachers themselves need to engage their students as well. I think primary school really is not necessarily the age where you need to have some of these agents as much prevalently used. But I think that's when secondary schools are when students are actually starting to engage with some of these things. So the challenge for many of us is that our educators, our teachers need to be first also educated how to use some of these AI technologies before they can also effectively use the students. And that's not an easy task, whereas many people have different conceptions and so on. So absolutely, I think we need to teach these skills, but we also need to teach ourselves as well before we can teach others.
One more question. Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, perfect. Greetings from Tlapacoya, Veracruz. Okay. Wonderful, the conference, excellent ideas and proposals. Question, how do you consider that AI can contribute in a negative way to the development of more plagiarism and forgery in written work or research so that the students can misuse these new tools?
No, I mean, it's happening all the time. I mean, I don't know how much is happening in your universities, but whatever students send you, it'll be having lots of generative AI used. for different types of essays. I mean, I'm speaking to different colleagues. So students are already using that. The question is that plagiarism? Probably it's not plagiarism per se, but it's also not their own work, right? So really, we are now, I think, in this big transition period where we need to completely reinvent the assessments that we are doing. But it also requires us to rethink. That's why I was actually talking about us to rethink the skills that our students need to have. With the assumption that students will be using some of these AI when they are doing certain things, then what is the task that they need to be working on? I don't have straight answers because every domain, every subject, every type of task has their own specificities and we'll have to do that. But that's why we need to have that engagement because students are using it. They are not going to back away from that because they're going to continue using it for the rest of their lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dragan, for all the answers you have provided us. We have like other 20 questions left, but we want to thank you for your great explanations and the time you have dedicated to this space for questions and answers. Now I want to give the floor to Dr. Boris Escalante to help us close this session of the seminar.
Thank you very much, Professor Gašević. This has been a very enlightening talk. I keep your last answer about how educators, we have to rethink the kind of skills that we want to develop in our students in view that these kind of tools are available for everyone and we have to take advantage of them. So we have to rethink the whole education process so that we can meditate what are the skills that we want to develop in our students, and definitely the traditional way of doing education has to change with this tool. You can see the enormous amount of people interested in your talk. There were, at the point there were about 500 attendees in the talk. So this talks about the interest that you have generated with this talk, and I really have to thank you very much for your lecture, for your very inspiring lecture. And I think I speak on behalf on everyone that this has been a very special lecture. Thank you very much, Professor Gašević. I'm not sure if Melchor, are you there, Melchor? Do you want to say something to
Well, yes, I'm here. Well, Dragan, thank you very much for your presentation. It was fantastic, this roller coaster of evidence. And I loved your comment about the last meta-analysis about because the effect size in that meta-analysis are impressive, 0.7, 0.8.
Absolutely.
I love that you questioned that very much because I agree with you that research has to be solid and with methodological rigor. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Well, and thank you for your time. I mean, it's not usual that international speaker is agreed to answer all the questions of the audience. So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. I was so impressed with your audiences asking so many questions. That's what I love. So that's really the food for me as well.
And you're in Melbourne, Australia now?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, so okay. Have a nice weekend. Almost.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much again, Dragan Gašević. Thank you very much for this lecture. And thank you very much to all the attendees that were present in this lecture. So we'll see you in the next seminar. Thank you very much, Dragan. We'll send you your certificate thanking you for this lecture by mail, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. All right.
Bye.